They called it the Forgotten War, not because it wasn't brutal, not because the stakes weren't real, but because America looked away and never fully looked back. On June 25, 1950, 135,000 North Korean soldiers crossed the 38th parallel at dawn. They came with Soviet tanks, Soviet weapons, and orders from Stalin himself. South Korea's army collapsed within days. Seoul, the capital, fell in 72 hours. The United States had almost no troops on the peninsula. The ones they rushed in were undertrained, under-equipped, and completely unprepared for what was coming. The first American unit to engage the North Koreans was Task Force Smith, 540 men sent to stop an armored invasion. Their anti-tank rounds bounced off the enemy's T-34 tanks like thrown rocks. They were overrun. Dozens were killed or captured. It was a humiliation and a warning nobody heeded fast enough. By August, American and South Korean forces had been pushed into a tiny corner of the peninsula, the Pusan perimeter. They held on by their fingernails while the world watched. Then MacArthur made one of the most audacious military gambles in modern history. He landed 75,000 troops behind enemy lines at Incheon, a port his own generals said was nearly impossible to invade. It worked. The North Koreans collapsed. Seoul was retaken. The war seemed won. Then China entered. 300,000 Chinese troops poured across the border, not with tanks or artillery, but in near total silence, moving through frozen mountain passes at night. They hit the American lines with bugles screaming and human waves that seemed to have no end. The shock was complete. U.S. forces were thrown back. Seoul fell again. At the Chosin Reservoir, 15,000 U.S. Marines found themselves surrounded by over 120,000 Chinese soldiers in temperatures that plunged to negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Men's weapons froze. Morphine syringes froze before medics could inject them. The Marines had to hold the syringe in their mouths to thaw it. The dead were stacked on vehicles because the ground was too hard to dig. And yet, those Marines fought their way out. 78 miles through enemy lines. It remains one of the most extraordinary fighting retreats in military history. The war dragged on for 2 more years. Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination. Peace talks began and stalled and began again. Meanwhile, men kept dying for hilltops that had no strategic value except that neither side would give them up. Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, names that meant everything to the men who bled on them and nothing to the people back home who never heard of them. North Korea became the most bombed country in history up to that point. By war's end, 85% of its buildings had been destroyed. Millions of civilians were dead or displaced on both sides of the border. At least 2.5 million people lost their lives in the fighting. The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. Not a peace treaty, an armistice. A pause. The Korean War was never officially declared a war at all. It was classified as a police action. And to this day, it has never officially ended. Nearly 37,000 Americans were killed. Over 92,000 were wounded. 5.8 million Americans served. And most of them came home to a country that had already moved on, that had barely noticed they were gone. There is a memorial in Washington, D.C., 19 steel soldiers frozen in a patrol, mid-step, going nowhere. No crowd surrounded. No fireworks lighted up. Just silence, and the wind, and the names of men who deserved far better than to be forgotten. Now you know.